This would result in only 500 Israeli soldiers being in the Suez region at the time of invasion, facing over 80,000 Egyptian troops. Up in the north and the Golan Heights, the situation was just as bad, with 150 Israeli tanks facing a Syrian force in excess of 1,400 tanks. Facing such a force, it was no surprise that Israel was pushed back along both points of attack. However, Israeli High Command always knew that the possibility of something like this happening was high. This drove them to extensively train their troops in the art of lightning fast mobilization. This would result in their troops being in position to counterattack just 48 hours after the war began. This wasn't their first attempt at a counterattack, however, as one day earlier they attempted an air attack on Egyptian positions. They believed that since the strategy worked so well during the 6-Day War, there shouldn't be any reason why it wouldn't work now. However, limited success paired with losses resulted in the attacks halting. Egyptian troops would then take an extremely defensive stance as not to overextend past the range of their anti-aircraft guns and artillery. This made it extremely difficult for Israeli troops to have any sort of success. On the Syrian front, things did not look good for Israel. The entire southern region of the Golan Heights was occupied, and initial counterattacks were proving insufficient at stopping the assault on both fronts. Israeli High Command realized two things then and there: they needed more supplies and they needed to focus on one front. The entire Sinai was between Israel and Egypt, but the Syrians were practically on their doorstep, and they decided that reclaiming the Golan Heights was more important. Luckily for Israel, the Egyptian stance meant that Israel was basically free to focus their entire air force over the north, which would prove decisive at driving the Syrians back. Another tactical error was the Syrians holding atop the Golan Heights rather than pushing onto the Jordan River. This allowed for Israeli reinforcements to cross the river unopposed and rush to the aid of their forces. Days of intense fighting followed. For Israeli troops, defeat was not an option. Every one of them knew that a loss in this war would surely spell the end of their country. As the days progressed, Israel was finally making advances, and by the 14th, they were only 40 miles from Damascus. Syrian President Assad would request that Egypt do anything to take the pressure off. In response, Sadat's forces would push out of their defensive line, hoping they could push the Israeli troops back and force their commanders to reroute troops from Syria. This would be extremely risky, as it would mean their army leaving the protection of their anti-aircraft and artillery, making them an easier target for aircraft. Nevertheless, the army advanced, meeting dug-in Israelis. 1,000 Egyptian tanks would face off around 700 Israeli tanks, but the battle would go horribly for the Egyptians, with over 250 tanks and a further 200 armored vehicles destroyed. They would only be able to take out a fraction of the Israeli tanks, with only 6 damaged beyond repair. The biggest factor in this battle was Israel's air force, who, without the threat of anti-aircraft missiles, were able to completely decimate Egyptian tanks. The wind was finally starting to blow in Israel's favor. Things seemed to just get better for Israel, as on the 15th, the Americans finally arrived with desperately needed armament and equipment. On top of this, an Israeli patrol was able to discover a hole in the Egyptian defense, one they could use to bypass the Egyptian defensive line and potentially completely encircle it. The men tasked with the initial breakthrough were General Avraham Adon and Major General Sharon. In order to break through to the canal, one major obstacle still needed to be cleared: an Egyptian research station codenamed Chinese Farm. Israeli commanders severely underestimated the Egyptian presence there. The assault began at dusk on October the 15th. The fighting would be so incredibly close quarters that at times only meters separated Egyptian and Israeli positions. This, paired with the darkness of nighttime, meant that there was a lot of confusion of who was an enemy and who was a friendly. An Israeli tank commander said at one point an Egyptian soldier walked up to his tank and asked for a smoke, probably thinking it was an Egyptian tank, so he tossed a grenade at him. The battle would eventually result in an Israeli victory, but it would come at the cost of heavy casualties on both sides. The path was now open, and on October 19th, Israeli troops finally crossed into Egypt. Pushing forward, they knocked out Egyptian anti-air and finally opened up the sky to Israeli planes. The armies would then push north and south as planned, leaving the Egyptian Third Army in danger of being cut off. But even with this, Sadat refused to pull some troops back to meet the advancing Israelis. This decision would leave the Egyptian Third Army stranded, and with no food and water coming in, it would not be long until they were forced to surrender. And as for the Syrian front, fighting would continue, but the front would remain relatively unchanged for the remainder of the war, despite receiving troops from several neighboring Arab countries. As a last-ditch effort to save Egypt, the Soviets told the Americans they could either both send a peacekeeping force into the conflict or they would send their own troops in. America was so against Soviet troops in the Middle East that they put their entire nuclear arsenal on standby. The Soviets backed down, but the international pressure resulted in a ceasefire being signed on October 25th. While this didn't fully end the fighting, it would never exceed the level of some border skirmishes, and all fighting would eventually stop in January of 1974. It's unclear who truly won this war, with Israel once again proving it was a force to be reckoned with and preserving their country, but they did lose that invincible feeling they had, which is exactly the goal Sadat wished to achieve. On top of this, it gave a massive morale boost to Egypt, something Sadat needed to push for peace in the Middle East. In 1977, he would return to Israel and become the first Arab leader to officially recognize Israel's independence. This is what Israel really wanted, and with the knowledge that Egypt was no longer a threat, they would return the Sinai to them. With this, Sadat's dream was now realized, but he wouldn't live to see it, assassinated by gunmen opposed to his stance on Israel. Thank you for watching. If you liked the video and want to learn more about the history of the region, I'd highly recommend checking out B-List History's series on Gaddafi. You can find the link to it in the description down below. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and I'll see you next time.